welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
James Penca has studied Titanic and her incredible story for 25 years, an interest sparked by a school field trip to an RMS Titanic Incorporated artifact exhibit. Today, he serves as spokesperson and researcher for RMS Titanic Inc., as well as creative director of the virtual recreations by Titanic Honor and Glory, and host of the Witness Titanic podcast. James recently joined the exciting 2024 Titanic Expedition to lend his knowledge and passion for this legendary ship. You've actually probably seen some news about this expedition recently and some of the incredible images that they captured. Before we get to our truly fascinating conversation, I feel it's important to give you some background on RMS Titanic Inc. They're the company that was granted salvage rights to the wreck of the RMS Titanic by a United States federal court order in 1994 and reconfirmed again in 1996. The court award includes the exclusive rights to recover the artifacts from the wreck site. They're the only group allowed to do that. Using Titanic's artifacts in concert with scientific data and social history, RMS Titanic Inc. brings to life Titanic, the Artifact Exhibition. Their mission is to preserve the legacy of Titanic's maiden voyage, subsequent sinking, and the memory of her passengers and crew through care and display of their recovered artifacts, comprehensive educational programs, innovative exhibitions, research and recovery initiatives, wreck site imaging and analysis, and ongoing Titanic collaborations. James Penca, it is an honor to have you here in the Parlor. Welcome, dude.
It is an honor to be here.
I discovered your podcast, well, as soon as you put it out. When did you put the first episode out?
It was like my birthday, I think, like June. I'm pretty sure I put out the first batch of like 2 episodes, I think. That's my memory of it.
I am experiencing what a lot of nerdy podcast listeners go through when they discover a podcast. A lot of times I discover a podcast after they've been out for a couple of years. And what do?
Right.
You get excited to binge
Oh, yeah.
1 million episodes. And I'm struggling with your show because I'm hearing it real time and there are no episodes to binge. So I'm like, come on, man.
I know. It's tough. Yeah, I think I only have 12 right now or 11. So yeah, you'll catch up real quick.
Yeah. So speaking of birthdays, I share a birthday with the evening that Titanic struck the iceberg.
April 14?
On April 14th.
Oh, that's the best birthday.
It's also not the same year, though. I'm sure that my listeners, may have realized that. It also happens to be the day Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater.
That's right. April 14th is a big day of the year for sure.
Big day in history. I was 7 years old when the wreckage was discovered, but sadly, I don't remember seeing anything about it or discussions about it. But particularly since the 1997 film, and I'm quite a bit older than you, so I was a young college student at that time. Before then, I think the Titanic was just something out of a history book, right?
Yeah.
I had nowhere near an accurate concept of it, I'm sure, and I wasn't nearly as interested in history then. But when you dramatize it and when you also stage it in a Broadway musical, which I know you and I both are nerds about,
Of course.
suddenly the story becomes real. And I've since gone in and out of periods where I'm fascinated and jump back into the rabbit hole. And, when I think about the Titanic, the heartbreaking vision of the pairs of boots that lie empty on the bottom of the ocean comes to my mind. I think about the light fixtures and decorative ironwork that looks so much more haunting in their current condition. And I also think about that final scene of James Cameron's Titanic, which I know I've heard you talk about, where years later, a fictional Rose returns to see a fictional Jack still there on the ship,
Right.
along with the whole crew, the captain and the passengers. It's so haunting. And part of me wants the afterlife to be, a perfect wrapped up ending, just like that. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, I really hope that, and this might be a bit morbid, but I suppose your audience might be more open to it.
Oh, yeah, we're weird.
Yeah, the Titanic community might not be as into it, but I hope in the afterlife I get to visit Titanic in 1912. I get to walk around the ship finally, because that's kind of what I attempt to do every day through testimony, through the virtual recreations of one of the companies I work with, through the exhibitions of the other company I work with. I'm just, you could argue that my entire life has been trying to get back to Titanic. So if the afterlife is, all right, you can go do whatever you want now in any time. Like, oh my gosh, take me back to April 10th, 1912 and let me walk around the ship all day. That would be pretty great.
And talk to people.
Yeah. Meet people and interact and listen to the orchestra and have some tea in the lounge. Like just drink it all in. It would be pretty magical. I mean, the one thing you can do on this earth, in this life, is you can go to Belfast, Ireland, where Titanic was built, and sitting there is the last remaining White Star Line ship. All the others have been scrapped and destroyed many decades ago. But the last White Star Line ship, the Nomadic, is still sitting there, and it's been restored to its former glory, so you can walk around it. But it's so much more important because the Nomadic was built alongside Titanic and was meant to be like a mini Titanic because it was a ferry to take people to Titanic. So when people boarded Nomadic, it was like an appetizer for what they were about to board. And so you can walk around Nomadic and you're literally walking around the same interiors with the same steel, the same light bulbs, like the light bulb fixtures, the rose fixtures that the light bulbs will be screwed into. Everything is the same. So you can kind of board Nomadic and get that feeling. And when I boarded Nomadic, I was clearly in tears. So I can't imagine what the feeling would be to be on the real thing.
Speaking of feeling like you're on the real thing, we need to talk about your work with Titanic Honor and Glory, which I can't believe more people don't know about. That's actually how I discovered you, by finding that channel on YouTube. And actually, I do notice more recently, especially since the expedition, that there's lots of imagery that's being shared around that I think comes from Titanic Honor and Glory.
Yes.
And I understand that it kind of started in the video game world, which, as Gen X, video games to me means Dr. Mario and Pac-Man. So I don't really get that connection. However, there is hours and hours. If people want to just watch a video and explore what looks exactly like the Titanic, like you're there, it doesn't look like a cartoon. I mean, it just is amazing. We should tell people how to find that and let them explore.
Yeah. Titanic Honor and Glory began as a video game project meant to be, with a storyline and murder and mystery and, just a whole video game kind of design. That project never really went anywhere. It was way too big for its own good. And so recently, in the last few years during COVID, really, I took over the project and we decided to focus more on the history of Titanic. So while it is still an explorable video game-like project, we think of it more as a virtual museum than anything. There's no people on board. There's no drama. There's no gunfights or anything. It's just about the history. people can go on our YouTube, which is Titanic Honor and Glory. You can watch tours of pretty much the entire ship. I mean, we have virtually every space you would want to see. All that we're missing are just endless cabins and machinery spaces. So it's pretty much everything. You can watch the ship sink. Pretty much every year we release a video of Titanic sinking in real time. And one of those went viral many years ago. And so it's just the most beautiful recreations of Titanic you can find. And if you have a computer that can handle it, which not everybody does, you can explore Titanic yourself and download the Titanic. It's 50% of the ship. It's everything that we've ever made, and it's all completely free because we just love Titanic that much. And that's available on our website, which is titanichg.com.
Thank you. And just as delicious as that tour through the Titanic is hearing the passion in your voices as you all, especially like, on the anniversary when you go through the sinking and, the timed up facts and history that is known. Oh my gosh. And who doesn't love hearing nerds talk about what they love the most? So I do encourage people to go check that out. How were you introduced to the Titanic, and how, did you become the Titanic nerd and researcher that you are today?
My Titanic experience began, I saw the movie in 1997 when I was 6 years old. And it was the first adult movie I got, first grown-up movie I got to see. And we really enjoyed it as a family. We went back and saw it a second time, but it wasn't the big awakening moment. The big awakening moment for me was the following year when I played a video game called Titanic Adventure Out of Time, which was a 1996 computer game where you explored the Titanic and you had to solve a mystery. It very much inspired the video game project from Titanic Honor and Glory, of course. But exploring the ship in that project was just the most incredible experience. And it sparked an endless love for Titanic and a desire to see every inch of Titanic. So that sparked me, and I fell in and out of it, kind of like you described. I fell in and out of it. I got more into sports and then fell back in love with Titanic later. I got, once I got into high school and I had friends and I was more of like a normal kid, but then eventually I fell back into it again. I kept coming back to Titanic. And then during COVID, I was deeply into Titanic for many years at this point. But when I took over the creative side of Titanic Honor and Glory and tried to fix up the company to be a bit more productive and from a historical standpoint, that eventually led to RMS Titanic Incorporated reaching out to us. And then I started working with them more closely. Then I became an employee there. And then I got invited to go on the expedition this year. And now I'm the spokesperson for the company. I help them in any way that I can. So suddenly I'm very, very deep into a role at the largest Titanic company in the world. And I work as a creative director for the leading Titanic visual maker at Titanic Honor and Glory. And now I have a podcast. So now I'm just as deep into Titanic as one can be. But it all really started with that video game and just an undescribable need to explore the ship.
And how cool that you are kind of what is connecting Titanic Honor and Glory now and RMS Titanic Incorporated together, because now they're working together too, right?
Yes. Yeah. They reached out to work together and it was kind of a no-brainer. RMS Titanic Incorporated, we are the salver in possession of the wreck site. We're the company that recovers the artifacts and displays them around the world. And when they reached out to us, and still to this day, in a lot of ways, the visuals that you will see in their exhibits date back to the 90s. In fact, some of the visuals that they use in some of their exhibits are from the 1996 computer game that I, first played when I was a kid. They have very dated visuals, and they really did need an improvement. They could really benefit from using our visuals. But we, as a research company, we could really benefit from their historical resources. They have the artifacts and we are trying to recreate Titanic. So to have the ability to message the artifact people and say, hey, do you have one of these? And can you tell us how many inches across it is? Because we're trying to get a measurement of something that we've never seen outside of a black and white photo. So they're terribly useful in that capacity. And then we're terribly useful for them. So it's really a match made in heaven, to the point where, and people may think this is crazy, but it's just the way that we operate. There is no money exchanged between us. We give our visuals to them. They help us. It's really just a Titanic for Titanic agreement at this point, because we want to have our visuals in the biggest exhibits in the world, but we also want those exhibits to be as good as they can be, because a lot of us went into those exhibits when we were kids and it changed our lives. So we owe RMST in a way. And then we were allowed to partake in the expedition this past summer. THG was very much a part of it. And one of the biggest discoveries we made was primarily because of THG's researchers. So it's just been an incredible experience all around.
No, I think that's a really beautiful relationship between the two entities. Do you have your dream job now? I mean, is there anything cooler to go after this?
This might be it for me. My wife makes fun of me a lot. My friends make fun of, my family makes fun of me because they poke fun that this really is wild, that I spent my whole life being such a nerd about Titanic. And now I literally get to work essentially with the artifacts, which are actual pieces of Titanic. And I was literally on an expedition looking at Titanic directly above the shipwreck. It's really been a wild experience. The only thing on my bucket list that this job could still bring would be to recover something and be there when it's recovered. And I know what I want to recover. And it's been all over the news that we found the statue of Diana. To go back in the future and recover that statue, I think there's nothing cooler to do. There's nothing more meaningful than to bring something like that back to the surface so the public can enjoy it. I can't think of it. Maybe write a book one day. I don't know. It's tough. This is definitely the dream job.
Yeah, you just covered two of my questions. I was going to assume that it probably would be Diana that you would want to bring up. And I was going to ask you, if you had plans for a book, which I would definitely read.
Yeah.
But just like you said, this summer, you were given that great opportunity to work on the 2024 expedition that took you to that wreckage site. And it was the first official expedition in 14 years.
Yes.
I watched every one of your lives. And I want to know, I want to know so much. We could talk for hours, but I want to know what it was like when you were told that you had arrived,
Sure.
Or as you were getting closer, when you were sitting right over the top of it. Did you cry? Did you pee your pants? I can't imagine.
Arriving at the site was wild. It was very complicated, though, sort of a roller coaster of emotions, because you'd imagine that it would be this emotional moment. And I should have known, and I think people told me, you build it up in your head and you think it's going to be this big emotional, great moment. And it wasn't, because we arrived at about 3 p.m. So it was in the middle of the day, which you never imagine the Titanic sinking during the day. So that's kind of wild. But also, there was so much work to be done the second we arrived. Like, we got there and it was all hands on deck. We need to get these ROVs in the water. James, we need you to film this. James, we need you to go live. James, we need, it was...
You weren't there just to enjoy the experience. You were working.
Right. I was there to do research, to tell everybody what we're looking at on the screens. And then I was also there to do social media stuff, like do lives, as you said, and like post videos and take pictures. And they needed everything documented. And that was rough. There was a lot of work. And so we arrived, we got like a minute to sort of enjoy the moment. I did have some tears in my eyes when they turned off the ship and I looked at the little screen and it said 4143 north, 4956 west. Like, we are over the wreck. And I had a little moment, and then it was off to the races, and we had to get to work. And I did tell myself, tonight at 11:40, I want to go out on deck and I want to have a moment for myself. And that's what I did. And that's when I had my like more emotional time to be there. But the initial arrival was like business as usual. Like, we got to get to work. So it wasn't the moment I wanted, but I had plenty of moments. We were there for 20 days. I did not need much more.
And you said you were ready to kiss land.
Oh, yes. Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
As I said on my most recent episode of my podcast, you could have a favorite roller coaster, and after 20 rides on it, you'll be ready to get off. Like, it was so much work. There was very little sleeping, and the ship rocks so much that I didn't get seasick or anything, but you just cannot wait to stand still for 5 seconds. It's like someone's poking you all day, every day for 20 days. You just can't stop thinking about how the ship is moving, even while you're sleeping. I mean, I had sleepless nights where I guess I'm sleeping, but I was having dreams about being on an airplane that's going like this. It was exhausting. So yeah, getting back to land, even on a dream trip like that, we were very ready to disembark.
Yeah, and if I go back to catch a few things we've talked about, the rediscovered statue of Diana of Versailles, which served as the centerpiece of the first class lounge. If people have been under a rock and they haven't seen news about that, we're going to talk more about the podcast later, but you had an episode, a beautiful episode, and I recommend people catch that one on YouTube.
Yes. Yeah. There was some visuals involved on that one. Yeah.
The visuals are there and you're describing things. I mean, I teared up on that one. And the way that statue landed perfectly, looking up toward the sky, just waiting to be discovered is crazy.
Like a lot of things with Titanic, it's like it was written. It's like a storybook.
Yeah.
It's dumbfounding that the statue has survived this long, that she's looking up to the surface, just waiting to be found. I mean, and it fits with the Titanic vibe. I mean, people don't really think about it this way because when you think of a shipwreck, you think of Titanic. So you think that that's normal, that Titanic is the way she is. Most shipwrecks, they're so destroyed that they don't look like a ship anymore, or they're landing on their side. They landed upside down. They imploded while sailing down to the bottom of the ocean, so they're kind of destroyed. Titanic is sitting upright as if it's still sailing. It's not even leaning one way or the other. It is literally sitting upright, and the statue is literally looking up to the surface. These are miracles that this happens, like anomalies that this happens this way, but that's Titanic. And this gets into a topic of like afterlife and God and all that. But I remember as a kid being pretty, I had a big atheist phase when I was in Catholic school. And the one thing that made me think, well, maybe there is a God was Titanic, because it is so unbelievable that this happened this way, that I just have such a hard time thinking that it was all coincidence. So there's just some part of the Titanic story to me that is, I don't know what it is, the universe, a God, a spiritual thing. Everything happened so perfectly that it just seems too good to be true.
And I bet I have a lot of listeners with stories, that can relate to that. So thank you for sharing that. Not every artifact or object sitting at the bottom of that site is as big as the statue of Diana. Mm-hmm. But if you think about it, many of those artifacts are more personal. Speaking of getting woo-woo, with spiritual things.
Yeah, let's do it.
Many of those artifacts presumably have some kind of energy attached to it. What are the things that we learn or can learn about different artifacts, whether they've been brought up or are still there on the Titanic, about personal stories in people's lives?
Yeah. I mean, every artifact that we bring up has the potential to give us a window into someone's life who is long gone. Of course, some of the things we bring up a porthole. Okay, that's just a piece of Titanic. Very cool, very cool. But for a lot of us, it's the passenger stories or the crew stories. So a perfect example, that I've talked about on my podcast. We had an episode with the director of our artifact collection, and we talked a bit about stuff like this. But there are instances of, if you look at the third class passengers, for example, third class passengers were the poorest of the poor. They had literally nothing except for the clothes that they wore when they boarded. And they were coming to the United States with no prospects aside from the fact that America, apparently the streets are paved with gold. So anything is better than what we've been living in our home country. Many of these people were not escaping, or they were not coming to America to start a new life like we always were told in elementary school. Some of them were trying to escape pretty much certain death in their home countries. Like, I mean, they were we just get this very cartoonish idea of Irish immigrants or Middle Eastern immigrants or whatever, that they were coming over with such excitement. No, their home countries were being, destroyed by famine. And, a much better comparison would be the migrants at the southern border of the United States, like coming to the United States because it is, for some of them, it's their only option. So it's just much more dire. And these people died on Titanic. And when they died, they took with them everything that they owned. And there's nothing on land that is of any record of them. You can look up a lot of these names in third class, and you will find maybe a birth certificate. You will find their name on a census or two, and then you will find their name on the Titanic passenger list. That's it. No pictures of them, no record of whether they ever got married, no record of where they lived, aside from maybe that census when they were 2 years old. Like, they're gone. They're completely gone to history. We bring up a bag from the ocean floor, and the bag has some items in it, but not every bag has a ticket with a name on it. Some of them do, and that's awesome when we find that, because now we can say, oh, cool, this bag belonged to this person. But sometimes it's just random items in the bag. Maybe there's some jewelry. Maybe there's some, we found some playing cards in a guy's trunk, and maybe some letters to somebody, but no name other than that. But through modern technology, we can look at this bag and see that the ocean has wore away the letters that were on the bag that identified the brand name. But through using, UV light or whatever, we can see where letters used to be. Now we know the brand name of the bag, and it was actually like a mom and pop leather company in Paris. Great. Let's reach out to this family who still operates that leather company. They still have their records from 1912.
Wow.
We go through their records and boom, there's a match of a third class passenger aboard Titanic who bought a bag there the week before they left. And suddenly we can say this bag and this deck of playing cards and this piece of jewelry belonged to this one person. And suddenly we can tell this person's story for the rest of time. This person who otherwise would have just been a missing person who had no family back home. And we've done this many times. The example we use in one of my episodes is Marion Meanwell. We found her bag, and in her bag was a letter from her previous landlord saying that she was a good tenant. So when she got to the United States, maybe she could get an apartment. And we know nothing about Marion Meanwell, nothing at all. But now we know that she was a good tenant. That's one fact that we know about her. And that's a magical thing to me.
Oh, that is beautiful. Would you like to talk a little bit? And I know it's something that you end up having to cover a lot, and that is the endless debate about leave it alone versus preservation of the gravesite, because I'm assuming that there are probably listeners on both sides, or at least curious.
Absolutely. And what I'm about to go through, this is very much like a personal opinion. Like, I work for RMS Titanic Incorporated, and you can assume their opinion. They're the people who, bring up the artifacts and display them to the public. But these are opinions I've had for many years, but long before working for them. But they're very much my own thoughts, just as a heads up. So yes, there is a big debate. There are people who believe that the wreck site is a grave site and should be left alone, that we need to get over this and let the people rest, comments like that. And then there are people who think this is some of the greatest history that we have, some of the greatest stories that are down there. And as every day that goes by, we lose more of them because the wreck is deteriorating. these bags that we're talking about, we found a bunch of personal bags on the ocean floor during the expedition. And we're getting to the point where if we wait too much longer, they're not going to be worth recovering because they're going to be just mush. So in that debate, which I understand both sides, and people at RMST agree with this as well. Like, we totally understand there is that belief that it is a gravesite, but here are the facts of the case in my mind. First of all, the word gravesite, I think, is extremely unfair. That is an exaggeration. It is meant to, and this word was thrown around by early opponents of artifact recovery to sort of evoke some emotions within us. Like, it is literally not a gravesite because there are no human remains there, and there probably haven't been human remains there for well over a century, if there ever was human remains there. The majority, if not every single person who died aboard the Titanic died at the surface. If by chance any person made it to the ocean floor, which is so hard to imagine with currents being what they are. I mean, the debris field is such a scattering of objects. The ocean currents take things all over the place. But even if a person came to rest by the ship, the physics of underwater pressure aren't great for our human bodies. And then the currents take that away. And then even if beyond all of that, human remains would not last on the ocean floor longer than a few years. So at this moment, that wreck site is as devoid of life as possible. There's a crab here, there's a fish there, but it is truly a desert of sand and metal. So it is literally not a grave site. So all that's left is the spiritual side, which I totally understand. But now we're talking about leaving alone a source of some of the greatest history that we have, because we feel like there's something down there that doesn't want to be disturbed. And I can tell you that the amount of joy that these artifacts can bring. I mean, anybody who thinks that the Titanic is a gravesite, I encourage you to go to an RMST artifact exhibit and bring your niece or nephew or child or whatever and watch other people's children. Just watch people have such an emotional and wonderful, positive reaction to the artifacts. We get to appreciate a long lost bit of history. And these artifacts are a gateway to so many interests, whether it be fashion, interior design, ship design, artifact recovery, science, diving, exploration, history, shipbuilding. It's just, there's so many ways that you can become inspired by these artifacts, and to leave them alone, we don't get to have that. I mean, I wouldn't be where I am if I hadn't gone to a Titanic exhibit. I certainly wouldn't. And there's a lot of people who message me on a daily basis telling me that the artifacts affected them and changed them as a person. And in more than one email I've gotten, someone has described that going to a Titanic exhibit and seeing the artifacts saved them. They used the word saved them, gave them a purpose in life. And because of those emails, I'm very convinced that these artifacts have saved more people than Titanic took with her. The positivity that these artifacts have brought greatly outweighs the negativity of this, gravesite. And then my last little bit that I always say is, how long after a disaster does it become a candidate for archaeology? We go into Pompeii and we dig and dig and dig to find every ounce of history that we can. And there are human remains at Pompeii. At this moment, you can go to Pompeii with a shovel. Well, you can't legally do this, but you could go to Pompeii with a shovel, start digging. You will find human remains at some point because so many people were buried there. That is if you want to talk about a gravesite, there you go. But in Pompeii, it happened a long time ago. So it is basically an amusement park. You can buy a ticket and explore and get a coffee at a coffee shop that they built over the site of an old building. You can take pictures with the human casts that they've made. It's an incredible experience to go, but how is that different from Titanic? We do the same with Egyptian pyramids. We as a human race, we love the history of our people. And through archaeology, we study long lost civilizations. Titanic happened 112 years ago. If it was 212 years ago, would it be okay? So I don't know what the answer is, to be honest. But I do know that if you speak to virtually any descendant of a survivor, they will tell you, please go down there, recover everything you can. I dream of a day that you bring up my great-grandmother's wedding ring or whatever. We have an opportunity to remember these people, these third-class passengers with no name, nothing aside from a name, and we have an opportunity to help them live on. I can't say enough about the artifacts and enough about the research that we do. To leave Titanic alone is just such a sad thing. To leave her in the darkness, to just be lost to history would be such a shame to me personally.
Thank you for that. The way I look at it, people who die violent deaths or people who are murdered would not choose to have their souls remain in those locations.
Sure.
Anyway.
Yeah.
People are saying, well, that's their resting place. Well, I'm like, why would I rest somewhere? And if I am on the other side, or depending on how you look at, the afterlife, if I have crossed over, I'm living life partying anyway. I'm not resting at the place where I sank or where I was murdered or whatever. And those people who died on the Titanic or went down with the Titanic died wanting to be saved and waiting to be saved and waiting to be discovered. And if by chance someone's soul is still stuck there waiting, why would we not find them?
Yeah.
That makes me want to cry.
Yeah. I cry on a daily basis about Titanic because I do get the honor of seeing some of the artifacts more closely than others do. And when we're looking through this debris field, we took 2.2 million photos on this expedition this past summer. And when I'm looking through these photos and you happen across a shoe, and I should say about the whole pairs of shoes thing, that is another story that was created by people who try to push the gravesite thing, that there's a bunch of pairs of shoes and that's proof that that's where people landed. And so there were people there. We just took 2.2 million photos, and I've seen every photo of Titanic, every video of Titanic. It's very rare that you see two shoes sitting next to each other. And when you do, it's because they were in a bag and the bag has dissolved and the shoes are next to each other. It's very often like that. I would need to see a pair of shoes where the laces are still laced for me to be convinced, and that's rare to find as well. It's just an emotional thing to say that there's a bunch of shoes everywhere. But you will see one single shoe from time to time that fell, and maybe it was being worn by somebody. But that shoe has a history and a story, and it was purchased by somebody at some point, and that person was proud of that pair of shoes that they bought. A lot of third-class passengers bought clothing in preparation for their trip to New York, so when they arrived, they looked nice because they knew they needed to look their best. In one instance, a third-class girl, her mother took her to a hat shop and said, every American girl has a hat. And she's never had a hat before, but you need to have a hat. And so she actually boarded a lifeboat and left her hat in her cabin, not thinking she was going to leave the ship. She got out of the lifeboat to go get that hat. And she miraculously got in another lifeboat, and she did survive with her hat. But these items, they mean the world to these people. And so it's funny, like I try not to put too much emotion into the wreck, because I do think the value of bringing things up is so great, but it's impossible not to remember that these things have such a human element. But that's why they're so special.
Yeah. I want to introduce my listeners to your podcast, Witness Titanic, because I really think it's beautiful. And if people want to learn more about stories, particularly of witnesses, but I think there's potential of also hearing stories of those whose lives were lost.
Oh, yeah.
But before I do that, I think it's necessary to explain the U.S. Senate inquiry, which I didn't know about until your podcast. Do you want to describe that a little bit?
Yeah. So when Titanic sank, just like today, I mean, literally, as we record this, there is a investigation going on surrounding the Titan tragedy that happened last year. So when disasters happen, the government usually has to have some sort of investigation. And both the United States and the United Kingdom had their own inquiries into it. And in fact, the US one was surrounded by controversy to start because no one expected them to do it. This was a British ship built by the Irish. But according to the United States government, there were Americans on board, and it's a ship that was meant to visit an American port, so they have every right to investigate it. So they both held their own investigations. They both came to roughly the same findings. But the great thing about these inquiries is it gives us thousands of pages of witness testimony. And these words, the words of these passengers and crew, are some of the most valuable things to me personally. I used to read them when I was younger just for entertainment because it's fascinating to hear somebody describe this event that we'll never get to see with our own eyes. It's the closest you can get. And I also find watching documentaries and even reading books, you're really getting someone else's opinion. And I share my own opinion in the podcast as well. But going back to the source and reading the actual words is so important to me. And so that's where this podcast came from, is allowing us a chance to interview these survivors again and getting the modern context out of it.
I absolutely love it. What I want to do is I got permission from James to share the first about 2.5 minutes of the first episode of Witness Titanic.
Yes.
Then we'll chat a little bit about some of those stories on the other end.
In the evening of April 18th, 1912, the survivors of the Titanic disaster arrived in New York City and touched dry land for the first time since an event that would leave them and the world forever changed. The very next morning, the United States Senate interviewed the first witness of its month-long inquiry, an investigation meant to determine what really happened. The British Board of Trade would follow with their own investigation. Between the two inquiries, over 150 witnesses testified, and in the Board of Trade inquiry alone, 25,622 official questions were asked. A century later, we are no closer to all the answers. What really happened in the eyes of a passenger wasn't quite how a crewman would have described it. The Board of Trade did not interview a single third-class passenger, and second class was ignored by both governments altogether. Newspapers shared their own, often fictional stories, which only adds to the confusion, and 100 years of new questions, overdramatic retellings, and outrageous, clickbaiting conspiracy theories shroud Titanic in deeper mystery to this day. Mystery that, for better or worse, she has become synonymous with. Welcome to Witness Titanic, a new Titanic podcast where we ask questions just as those century-old inquiries once did. Every episode, we will interview a witness with a particular expertise in the Titanic field. Historians, authors, researchers, divers, artifact specialists, and yes, the survivors themselves will be called to testify once more. My name is James Penca. Join me in a modern look at what really happened that cold April night. I can guarantee you we will never find all the answers, but you may be surprised to see how close our efforts will bring us to Titanic herself.
Oh my gosh, y'all, you totally need to listen to that. And I thought that was a perfect way to introduce it to you. You know, when we talk about that inquiry, it blows my mind, and I know it does you too, because you've talked about it. Of the more than 80 witnesses interviewed, most were crew members and first-class passengers, I believe. Over 300 women survived the sinking of the Titanic, you've said. However, only 2 testified at the U.S. inquiry. What the?
Exactly. It's actually a perfect segue because The episode I'm working on today that's going to come out on Tuesday is an interview. Well, I like to call them interviews, but I'm interviewing somebody 112 years after they gave their answers, with one of the two women that testified in the U.S. inquiries. 3 women gave affidavits, and a few more women testified in the U.K. inquiry, but only 2 testified in the United States inquiry. And it's unfortunate because, and keep in mind, very few third-class people were interviewed, and no second-class passengers were interviewed on either side of the Atlantic. So
unbelievable.
So many stories were just lost. Someone did a stat at one point showing how many survivors were actually asked for their story, and it's like 20% of the survivors have ever told their story, and that is so tragic for us as people who want to know everything we can about Titanic, and all the more reason to be recovering artifacts and learning stories through that. But yeah, so this week we're going to speak with a woman named Ella White. She has a fascinating story that I'm going to dive into, and I'm even going to have my wife on, and she's going to provide the voice for Ella in her answers, which will be fun, and she'll give her perspective. And Ella is fascinating for a multitude of reasons. She was not only a first-class woman and one of the only women to give testimony, but by all that we can tell, she's certainly a great candidate for a potential passenger of the 1912 queer community, which is a rarity in the Titanic stories, because very few people were out and about in 1912 society. And she wasn't, but she had a female companion. They lived together her whole life, that sort of thing. But it's a fascinating perspective from that side of things. So all around, she's a fascinating person to hear what she has to say. And she gives, I'll ruin part of the episode here. She gives one of my favorite descriptions of the iceberg collision. Every person was asked, what was the collision like? And everybody has some pretty wild descriptions, because it's hard to describe what it is. And everybody experienced it differently. Some people slept through it. Some people were knocked over by the vibration. It's really unbelievable how different everybody experienced it. And she said it felt as though the ship ran over 1,000 marbles. And I think that's just such a creative way to describe it. So very excited to hear from her on the next episode.
I cannot wait to hear that for many reasons. Tell my audience the significance of the song used in your intro and outro of Witness Titanic.
Yeah, so the theme music that I use is a song called Songe d'Automne by Archibald Joyce. It's a song from the era, from 1912. It was in the White Star Line songbook. So if you were a passenger aboard Titanic, you could go up to the orchestra and request Songe d'Automne, and they would play it for you. It's the perfect song because it just, first of all, it just fits the vibe. It has it's pretty dark, but a driving sort of relentlessness. It makes me think of the Propellers whenever I hear it. But also it is thought to be, it is certainly a candidate for one of the last songs, if not the last song played by the ship's orchestra when the ship was sinking. Unfortunately, we'll never know for sure what the final song was, because no one saw the orchestra stop playing. But Autumn is one of the songs that is often pointed to, the other one being Nearer, My God, to Thee, which is the one from the film. That beautiful, da, 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 that beautiful, beautiful song. That one was chosen for the film because a lot of people said that was the last song played. So Autumn is just one of them, and it just fits my podcast better than Nearer, My God, to Thee does. So I went with that. But it's a beautiful, beautiful song that I love hearing for my episodes.
If people search correctly or search carefully, I should say, there is a haunting 1912 recording of that song that,
very cool.
If the information is correct on it, it would have been recorded not long after Titanic, and maybe, you never know, maybe even because of reports,
It certainly became popular. I mean, the guy who wrote it was still alive at the time, and no doubt it rose in popularity when Titanic went down. So I actually haven't thought about this, but I can't imagine what his response was, to
to be just a 1912, songwriter, singer-songwriter type, and have one of your pieces be credited as being one of the final pieces. That would be pretty wild.
And, speaking of artifacts, I think, and you and I are both musicians, and when I see that they have saved sheet music from the ocean floor.
Oh, yeah. Howard Irwin's sheet music. Yeah.
Sheet music that has survived when steel, disintegrates with the ink still on it. Amazing.
I mean, talk about, incredible stories to recover from the ocean floor. If any listeners are still not convinced that it's worthwhile, many years ago, we recovered a trunk from the ocean floor, and the leather of the trunk, usually anything with leather, tends to scare away all the bacteria that eats things. So anything in a leather trunk is going to be pretty well preserved. And so we recovered this trunk, and inside the trunk was playing cards, like there was lots of racetrack bets kind of stuff, so like a bit of a gambler. And there was sheet music that we were able to conserve to the point where it looks like, yes, it looks older, like it's definitely on discolored paper, but a musician could put that in front of them and they could play it on the spot. It's that clear. All of these items belonged to a gentleman named Howard Irwin. He was a musician, and his clarinet and a piccolo of some sort were recovered from his trunk as well. So his musical instruments. Howard Irwin would be on the victim list, basically, and his family held a funeral for him. And then a couple months later, he showed up at their front door because the night before the sinking, he went out drinking and ended up missing the Titanic the following morning. But his family assumed that he had died because he wasn't in New York when the Carpathia arrived. But little did they know he was in Egypt somewhere, having been shanghaied. It's a whole story. But his possessions went to the bottom of the ocean floor, his trunk on board, thinking he would meet him on board. And so we have all this sheet music, letters to his girlfriend, Pearl. Pearl died of tuberculosis while he was out on his adventures. And so he was coming home to mourn. Just such an incredible story of a person who wasn't even on Titanic, but he's forever linked to it. And so his possessions are in our exhibits as a very unique story.
I have sheet music from that era in my possession that looks worse.
Sure. Yes. Oh my gosh.
Sheet music. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. I mean, people have often pointed at the movie and thought there's no way that drawing of Rose would have survived underwater, and it absolutely would have. It actually, the way that it looks in the film is pretty accurate to how some of our paper looks when we bring it up. So, in fact, I think that's probably why James Cameron put that piece of paper in Jack's leather book, because the leather would have kept away a lot of the things that eat organic material.
So let's discuss one witness that you've interviewed so far. Tell us about the love-hate relationship that the world tends to have with Bruce Ismay.
Of course.
And, that coward label that I think is unfairly placed upon him. And, I thought you did a spectacular job of covering him fairly in your part 1 and part 2 episodes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Bruce is the villain of the Titanic story. He has a handlebar mustache, which is perfect. He, in every depiction of Titanic, from A Night to Remember, all the way up to James Cameron's film, if a Titanic movie came out today, he would be the villain again. He's always the villain. He's always the guy telling Captain Smith to go faster. We need to get into New York early. We need to break records. I don't care about safety regulations. I don't care about icebergs. We need to make history. And then, there's always some dramatic line where the captain tells him, "You may get your headlines, Mr. Ismay." It's all very dramatic. And even the guy who wrote the script and directed A Night to Remember, the original Titanic film, or the most famous one back in the day, he even said, I had to make Ismay the villain because it's just, I'm making a movie here. There has to be a villain. And for the same reason, he made Thomas Andrews the ship's designer. Even though he's not really the designer, it's kind of complicated. But James Cameron did the same thing. So it's all about storytelling. The truth of the history
is that Bruce Ismay was on board. He was the owner of the shipping company. He would have had, maybe had the ear of the captain to say, like, how are things going? But according to Ismay's own testimony, he was never on the bridge before the disaster, and he was not seen on the bridge by anyone else before the disaster. He never interacted with Smith aside from a few conversations. A woman overheard a conversation where they talked about maybe arriving early, but people have taken that, and they did the moment that the Carpathia arrived in New York. The newspapers took it and ran with it and said he was pushing them to go faster. When the truth is, like, he might have just been saying, wouldn't it be nice if we arrived early? You're doing a great job, Captain Smith. Like, there's no reason to believe that he was an evil person. There are people who will point at some research that was done about Bruce Ismay that he was actually a really bad guy. But even that research was done by a journalist who was trying to create this narrative that Bruce Ismay was a bad person. Bruce Ismay's life was ruined by this. He couldn't go out in public. He was ridiculed. There were newspaper comics about him being J. Brute Ismay, that he was a coward. He is literally the standard for coward in our culture. You can go into any Titanic exhibit, not ours, but other Titanic exhibits. You can go on a Titanic tour, and you'll be told that he was the bad guy, because we need a bad guy. We need that story, because it's not as interesting to say that Titanic sank just out of sheer bad luck and happenstance. It's much more fun to say that there was a bad guy involved. And if you really listen to the stories, really read about the man and read about how the Titanic sank, even if he did say, I'd love to get into New York early if you can make it happen, it's the captain's job to make those decisions. The captain listens to nobody. And Captain Rostron, the guy who was captaining Carpathia, who rescued everybody, he backs up Ismay in a lot of ways by saying, as a captain, I listen to nobody. If an owner told me to do something, I would say politely, no. And it is on Captain Smith to run his ship in the correct way. But it's not even his fault either. Titanic sank because it was being operated in the way that every single ship was being operated at the time. It was the normal circumstance of being on an ocean. You just did it like that. Iceberg warnings didn't mean anything to anybody. Now they do, of course, but at the time, nobody would have slowed their ship down, really. I mean, maybe some people would have, but it was the normal operations of the time. So in our Ismay episode, I really try to speak on his behalf. Of course, things could have been different, but he certainly didn't deserve to have his life completely ruined.
And I'm here to tell my listeners that I would have been fighting to get on a boat.
Oh, and that's the whole nother thing. People say he should have stayed. What are you talking about? First of all, we're all human beings. We all deserve life. No one deserves to go down with a ship. Maybe a captain does. I don't even know if that's really true. But if you can survive, why shouldn't you? Also, by all accounts, he helped load lifeboats all night long. And in one of the very last lifeboats to leave, when it was empty, there were empty seats, there were no women around, he and a couple other men were allowed in, so he got in. He was also a passenger, not a crew member. And then the best reason of all, if Bruce Ismay dies and we lose his testimony, I cannot tell you how much we would lose in terms of research and understanding what happened to Titanic. He witnessed conversations that no one else witnessed, and that's huge. So I would never in a million years tell anybody that they deserve to go down with the ship, even if it was their fault. And then certainly not Bruce Ismay, whose testimony is far too valuable.
Yeah, so y'all adjust your thoughts about Bruce Ismay. A listener just yesterday actually reminded me, and I'm not even sure I ever knew this, that a gentleman named W.T. Stead or Steed, I forget how you say his last name.
I think it's Stead. Yeah.
Yeah, was a figure in spiritualism, which, we cover a lot on this show. And, it's one of the last things on his Wikipedia page is, oh yeah, Stead went down on the Titanic.
There's actually, to go off on a little tangent, there's quite a few great stories, spiritual kind of stories with Titanic, of people having premonitions and people just having bad feelings about things. There's multiple women who had a bad feeling from the moment they boarded the ship. One woman who refused to get out of her day clothes ever throughout the voyage because she just had a feeling something would happen and she wanted to be ready. And at the time, a first class woman to get out of your day clothes and to put on your night clothes would have taken 30 minutes. It's just, there's just so much that goes into it.
Yeah.
So she would sleep in her day clothes because she knew she wanted to be ready. Another woman refused to sleep at night. She only slept during the day because she knew something was going to happen. But then the ultimate one, I forget the passenger's name, unfortunately, but she woke up in the middle of the night having heard a collision. And she shook her husband awake and said, "We've hit something. Go up on deck and see what happened." And he, begrudgingly said, okay. He went up on deck, checked with an officer who said, "No, we haven't hit anything." He comes back to bed and says, "Honey, we're fine. You just had a bad dream." So they go to sleep. The next night, Titanic hits the iceberg. She wakes up, shakes her husband and says, "We hit something." He goes up on deck, comes back and says, "Okay, this time you're right." But, so she literally 24 hours earlier had a bit of a premonition. There's stories, so many stories of Titanic passengers who spoke with a medium or a fortune teller in Egypt or in whatever exotic country they were visiting that told them, beware of water. Those kinds of stories, like with a lot of disasters, they kind of pop up because it's interesting. People kind of exaggerate their own experiences, but certainly
we get that a lot with 9/11, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good parallels with 9/11 in terms of, everybody was supposed to be at the World Trade Center that day, but decided to stay home. Everybody had a brush with disaster because when these things happen, I don't know what it is about human beings, but we want to be a part of it, I guess. We want a little bit of the attention. So we were like, oh, I was supposed to be at the World Trade Center that day or whatever. My flight was supposed to go there. So that happens. But with Titanic, of course, that happened. Everybody claimed to have had a ticket on Titanic, but decided not to go last minute because of a premonition or whatever. But there's certainly some credible ones of people boarding Titanic, knowing that a fortune teller told them to beware of water. And that might just be confirmation bias or whatever, but it's still very interesting. So there is a lot of premonition-based sort of woo-woo stuff, as you said, with Titanic. I think it's impossible for it not to be, personally, for such a terrible thing to happen, for us as people, for somebody not to be able to feel it coming is an interesting thing that I know personally I'm not in tune with anything. Like, I fully believe in ghosts. I fully believe in spiritual things. I just know that I personally have no ability to get in touch with it. So I've never had any experiences, but like my wife, for example, she's extremely in tune with it. So I think if we were boarding Titanic, my wife would be the person to say, "I think we should stay home. I just have a terrible feeling." I can't tell you how many times she says, "I don't think we should do this." And then it turns out to be a great call.
Wow.
And meanwhile, I'm completely oblivious to it. So I certainly believe a lot of the stories of passengers saying that something bad is going to happen. Like women who literally, the minute they boarded the ship, some women's intuition in their head said, "I'm not going to sleep during the night. I just can't." It's fascinating.
Wow. And maybe your wife needs to be our next interview.
Yeah. Yes. She's certainly much more in touch than I am. And I should say, we have a friend who is a medium and she does readings and she does our readings and stuff. And she was doing our readings during COVID. And one of the things that she said to me, this was before any of this Titanic stuff really kicked off. In her reading to me, she said that I would be doing some work in the ocean pretty soon, some sort of expedition. And I literally went on the expedition this year.
Wow.
Which, while it seems like that's not a very far-fetched thing to say, I'm a Titanic researcher. Of course, I was eventually. But when this reading happened, there was literally no reason to think. I had zero connections with RMST, and to think that within a few years I would be at the Titanic wreck site. I'm pretty sure I laughed it off at the time because there's no way that that's going to happen, and it did. So,
wow. Well, thank you for sharing that too.
Yeah.
I'll give James the opportunity to give any other sites or social media he wants to give, but I can tell people that RMS Titanic Incorporated, you can find that at discovertitanic.com. And, I'll put the link to the Witness Titanic podcast in the show notes. On YouTube, it's Witness Titanic. And if anybody does reach out to James, make sure you thank him for giving me 30 extra minutes of time. I have
Oh my gosh.
totally held him captive for this wonderful interview. And so thank you for doing that for us. I guess just if there's any final thoughts you have, anything you want to leave my listeners with, something that, you wish you would have had the opportunity to discuss. And then, if you'd like to leave us with the singing of Barrett's song or the proposal, from Titanic, the musical, feel free to do that too.
That's the one thing I wish we had time to talk about. Let's get into Titanic, the musical. I do have a pretty cool little story I'll share with you. It doesn't have to be in the episode. It's just because you have a knowledge of Titanic, the musical. It is a great story. I've done Titanic musical so many times, and I've served as a researcher or, a dramaturg on it, I suppose you could say, a couple times. And when I was in high school, they did a reunion concert in New York at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. And one by one, all the original cast members dropped out of this concert, but I had bought tickets. So I flew to New York. It was my first time in New York by myself. And I saw the production, and the only person really left in it was Martin Moran, who played Harold Bride in the original. And if there was one person I would want to see, it would have been him, and then maybe Brian Darcy James as Frederick Barrett. But I went up to him after the show because it was that kind of small concert. They were just sitting there. So I went up and I thanked him for his work on the musical, because the musical had a big effect on me as well. And his song in particular, The Night Was Alive, got me into college because I sang that song as my audition. And I started to cry while I talked to him, because I cry for moments like that. And he started to kind of get emotional because he's like, listen, man, I've done like one musical that's like really well known. I don't have fans who come from Ohio to see me and then cry when they meet me. Like, this never happens. So we took a picture, and he told me then that I would have a great theater career or something. Like he's like, I'm going to make a premonition or whatever. And he put that out into the universe. And I never heard from him or interacted with him for years and years and years. And then during COVID, a man came into a restaurant I was working in, and I looked at his COVID vaccination card because I had to let him in. He needed to be, like we all had to do. And I saw on the card, it said Martin Moran, and I handed it back to him, and I sat him at his table, and I like panicked in the kitchen for a bit. And then I went out and I told him the whole story that I just told you. And before I could finish it, he goes, "Are you the kid from Ohio?" And I was like, "Yeah, that was me." And so we had another moment, and so we got coffee and we caught up, and it was great. Then suddenly this Titanic stuff starts picking up, and my theater career, it seems like it's coming to an end, and I never got to be on Broadway, and I was having a hard time letting go of that. I wasn't sure what to do with my life. Like, do I give up on theater and really focus on Titanic? And Martin agreed to go on a walk, and we talked all about it. And a big part of it was that he told me I would have a big theater career when I was a kid. And I felt like I needed to like honor that or something. So I talked to him about it, and he goes, "James, it doesn't matter whether it's theater or Titanic or whatever. You are a storyteller. That is what you do." And that hit me really hard because I've never been described as a storyteller before. And I always describe my dad as a storyteller. Like, he tells stories like nobody's business. And like, yeah, my family is a bunch of storytellers. That's all I want to do is tell stories. He's like, doesn't matter if it's a musical or Titanic, you are a storyteller. So if you want to step away from theater and focus on Titanic, you're still doing the thing that you want to do. And I was like, you're so right. So a couple months later, RMST hires me full time. They send me the contract, and I did not talk to them about what my position would be, but the original contract they sent me said Titanic researcher and storyteller. And I just about, dropped to the floor. And I told Martin this, and he was like, told you, like, Martin just had this way of like giving me the most amazing advice, and it always kind of comes through. So yeah, my original contract, we ended up changing it, so people understand. It became spokesperson and not storyteller. But that first contract saying storyteller really meant a lot to me. So, so that musical, everything Titanic related has just been so important to me. So I do love that musical. It has many special places in my heart, and not just because it's the musical, but because of stories like that.
Oh,
sorry, that was a big tangent that may not make the final episode.
No, message received.
Yeah, exactly. Message received.
I love that so much. How can people find you or reach out to you if I haven't already mentioned it?
So yeah, we have for RMS Titanic Incorporated, it's discovertitanic.com. If you want to hear more about the expedition and see the pictures of the Diana statue that we found and hear the story of the railing that fell over, like, pretty dramatic stuff in the Titanic world, you can go to expedition.discovertitanic.com. And if you want to see the artifacts in person, there's permanent exhibits in Orlando and Las Vegas, but there are traveling exhibits all around the world. Be mindful, though, to go to a Titanic the Artifact exhibition, not Titanic the Exhibition, which is a different company. They do not have the artifacts that we have. They're still fun, but you'll walk in and you'll ask a person, where are all the artifacts? And they just won't have any. So go see one of those exhibitions. As for Titanic Honor and Glory, you mentioned, our YouTube channel is probably the best way to look at our things. We've got so many wonderful visuals online, and that's at Titanic HG is the YouTube handle. And then, Witness Titanic. It's on YouTube. It's wherever you get your podcasts. And that's pretty much everything. I'm on Instagram, but I don't really post anything special. It's just my own personal thing.
And if you search hard enough, you will find videos of James performing, and he has a beautiful voice and also plays guitar. Mm-hmm. And you write music as well, correct?
Oh, no. I do not write music. That is something I could never understand how people do that. My skill is the storytelling, the playing. I'm a big Beatles fan, and I hold the Beatles almost as highly as I hold the Titanic story. I take pride in playing their music really well. Like I think I'm a good mouthpiece of great art, but I can't make the art on my own.
Well, the voice is worth it. I'll just tell listeners that.
Well, thank you very much.
James Penca, you rock. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I love talking about Titanic, and just when you reached out, and your podcast just has such a interesting angle, and Titanic is such a spiritual kind of otherworldly topic. It really lends itself well. So thank you for the invite.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. And you can continue the discussion and hang out with a great community of Paranerds by joining us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Want to hear your voice in a future episode? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.
Thank you to the following super Paranerds who support this show at patreon.com/Big Seance. Sue, Jen, Michael Henson, Daryl, Anne Marie Sullivan, Natalie N., Josiel Lorenzo, and Susan Davey. My supporters at the Parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Anne Rekovich from ozparatech.com, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Janae Michaels from Greyhouse Tarot and Farm Artifacts, Amy Park Gedicke of amyparkg.com, Lonnie Scott from weirdwebradio.com, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, Midge Munster from midgemunster.com, Heather N. of dancingbeealchemy.com, Diane Razmataz, Stephen St. Amour, Tracy, Andrew Watson, Amy Taylor, Danielle Hembury, Christine Rathselhe, Mindy Kintop, Hope Battaglia, Cass and Bailey, Melissa Armour, Janet Shaw Benz, Bruce Williams, and Christopher Kohler. And I currently have 4 fabulous listeners who support the show at the $10 level, which isn't even a thing. Those Paranerds are Glenna Becker, Peggy Hagan, and Steve and the lovely Judy Skinner. I also have 3 wonderful listeners who support the show at the completely made-up $20 level. And those peeps are Norman and Linda Keller and Kevin Gilbert. Thank you, Paranerds.